Welcome to the Need to Know podcast from the Wilson Center, a podcast for policymakers available to everyone. Always informative, nonpartisan, and relevant, we go beyond the headlines to understand the trend lines in foreign policy. Welcome back to another episode of Need to Know. I'm your host, John Milewski. Need to Know is a podcast produced by the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The center is congressionally chartered, scholarship-driven, and fiercely nonpartisan. Need to Know is a podcast for policymakers available to everyone. Well, today we welcome two special guests to the program to share with us what they learned on a visit to the Darien Gap. The gap connects Panama to Colombia. Once considered impassable, it's now a major migration route through the Americas. An article in The Atlantic described the treacherous passage as 70 miles in hell. Joining us to talk about their firsthand experience in the Darien Gap are the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, Ambassador Mark Green, and the chief of staff and senior advisor to the president, Eddie Acevedo. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, John.
So let me begin, Ambassador Green, with you, if I could, and ask you about some context for the trip. Why did you end up traveling there, under whose auspices, and what did you hope to learn?
Well, we traveled with the United Nations. We traveled with the government of Panama as well as the government of Costa Rica. But really, the reason we went was to understand the context of what's going on there. A lot of people have heard of the Darien Gap, and we know that the numbers of people who are passing through are extraordinary and on the rise. We wanted to understand what's driving them, what do they encounter, and what do we back here in the U.S. need to understand about those who are making the treacherous journey?
Eddie, your first impressions. Had you been there before? First, I know you have ties to the region. Had you ever been to the Darien Gap?
No, I've traveled to Panama several times, but not to the actual Darien Gap. So this is my first time.
And you know, Panama has launched this new PR campaign, right? And the translation, the Darien Gap is not a passage, it's a jungle. If I can get both of your thoughts on, has that had any impact?
Well, so, you know, it's a desperate effort on their part, given all the disinformation and the information put out there, particularly by human traffickers. So it comes about because human traffickers in and around Colombia are doing their very best to entice families to pay money and to undertake the journey. And they're trying to argue that it really isn't so bad. It isn't so dangerous. It isn't so treacherous. And what Panama is trying to do in countering it is just tell the truth. It is, in fact, a jungle. It's a dangerous jungle. In fact, one of the number one drivers of stress for those who are making the journey is coming across the dead bodies of those who didn't make it. So it is a dangerous place, and Panama is just doing its very best to help people understand what lies ahead.
Eddie, can a PR campaign that makes people aware of the dangers really have an impact when we're talking about people in desperate straits who are willing to risk their own lives and the lives of their family members to make the journey?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's had a limited impact. The Panamanians are working with the U.S. in order to be able to take some of the migrants and fly them back to their home countries. So it is limited. However, one of the things that we saw when we were there was that 70% of the migrants that were coming through were from Venezuela. And when we asked them directly, why are you leaving Venezuela right now? They all said in unison they were leaving because of Maduro. Maduro continues to try to steal the elections in Venezuela. And unfortunately, many of these Venezuelans are losing hope. And with that, they're voting with their feet again, and they're leaving, and they're taking this treacherous journey. As the ambassador mentioned, one of the things that we saw was many young children. We saw moms carrying 10-year-old babies. We saw parents with children, that were, 2 to 4 years old. And they posed a question back on us. And they said, imagine how terrible the situation is in Venezuela at the moment under Maduro, that we would rather take this very dangerous path in the jungle with these young children in order to seek a better life.
John, I'll just add to it. One of the people that I spoke to was a Panamanian security official, armed, with a bulletproof vest on. and he said, look, I'm a tough guy. I'm afraid of the jungle. He said, can you imagine how bad things must be in Venezuela for a woman, a mother with a 7-month-old baby coming through navigating that jungle? That speaks of the kind of desperation that I think is hard for us as Americans to comprehend.
About that, both of you certainly have been following this issue, know this issue. You've both had extensive experience in various parts of the world and seen desperate situations. But if you could share with us the visceral experience of what you observed when you were there. I know, Eddie, you just mentioned that people's response about Venezuela and Maduro. I read in the op-ed that you co-authored for the Miami Herald that many of those responses came from people who were arriving in canoes to a UN facility. What were you, talk to us about the human experience that you had and how it maybe broadens your perspective or changes your perspective of the nature of the crisis.
So I think one of the things that I found the most alarming was the fact that if we don't deal with the root causes of some of these problems, they're going to continue. In Panama, we saw the direct impact of the mismanagement and corruption in Venezuela and what that is doing to migration. In Costa Rica, we saw how the Ortega regime in Nicaragua is becoming the hub for international trafficking of people, not only through the Darien Gap, but also through charter flights that are flying directly into Managua. And both of these entities are benefiting both politically and economically because of these migration flows. The other thing that I found a bit more in the optimistic bucket, if I may, is the fact that we have great allies in Costa Rica and in Panama. We have two governments, two heads of states who are very much pro-U.S., who want to work more closely with the U.S., be able to offer more cooperation. And you juxtapose that with what we're seeing in Mexico, when we have a government in Mexico who's not as cooperative with the U.S. as we would like. And you begin to wonder, a lot of times when we talk about migration, we make the mistake, in my opinion, of focusing on U.S.-Mexico and the border without thinking about pushing that border figuratively further down south and working with allies such as Panama and Costa Rica, who really are doing the right thing, want to seek U.S. support, and I think it's up to the U.S. to be able to meet them halfway.
Ambassador Green, as I prepared for this interview with you and Eddie, and I also did an interview recently with Molly O'Toole, one of our current fellows who's writing a book about migration in the Darien Gap. And one of the things that, of course, I should have anticipated, but was surprised to know the extent of, is how much exploitation is taking place among these very vulnerable people. I guess human nature, if there's a buck to be made, somebody's going to try to cash in. Could you talk to us about that aspect of what's happening in the Darien Gap?
Yeah, actually, that was one of the things I think was most striking to us. Every step of the way in this journey, and it's, again, a dangerous, long journey, somebody's making money off this process. So we've got human traffickers who are charging $300 a head and more per person, man, woman, child, in order to navigate the jungle. Then they come out of the jungle, they're paying $10 a head to go on canoes. They're paying $30 to $60 per head to get on buses. Every step of the way, somebody's making money off this process. And that was one of the elements to this that we mentioned to UN officials. Unless we disrupt this flow, unless we stop the money from flowing in, particularly into the pockets of Daniel Ortega, it's going to be very hard to get to where we want to be in terms of restricting the exploitation of people and restricting the human flow. I mean, it's a dark trade. Those who come through are traumatized. In so many ways, they're traumatized. They're among the most vulnerable people on the face of the earth, and bad guys are exploiting them and making money off the process. We need to shut that down. We need to go back to the sources. We need to go back to the mismanagement of Maduro in Venezuela and the tyranny that he's imposed upon people. We have to go after Daniel Ortega and what he's doing, how he's profiting from all of this. Because if we don't do that, we're going to have more and more people coming, more and more people vulnerable and preyed upon. And again, that is about as dark a situation as I can imagine.
And Eddie, the humanitarian response from the United Nations and others, how significant is it, and does it come close to meeting the need?
Well, it does not come close to meeting the need, but it was very humbling to find out that much of the humanitarian response is being provided with the help of the United States government. That's the good news. The bad news is that it's pretty much all coming from the United States government. We need other nations in the international community to focus and to help on this matter. It's not sustainable for just the U.S. government to be able to be providing this type of assistance.
And Ambassador Green, your old stomping grounds, USAID, and I know, Eddie, you were there too with the ambassador. What is their role in the region, and are we, the U.S. government, adequately funding those needs?
Well, so let me answer the last part of that. No, of course we're not, and that's one of the dangers, one of the risks inherent in what Eddie just mentioned. So the U.S. is far and away the largest humanitarian donor in the world. I am proud of the leadership role the U.S. is playing. However, the numbers involved, the costs involved, they're not sustainable. And what they're doing is beginning to cannibalize and eat into some of the development investments we all know we need to be making. So part of the answer to all this, of course, is helping to stabilize communities, create economic opportunity, alternative livelihoods in some of the source countries. But so much of the money is taken up in the humanitarian side, which is treatment, not cure, that it's becoming a perpetual problem. So there are countries in the world that love, quite frankly, to preach to the U.S. On migration and otherwise. Quite frankly, they need to step up, because if this doesn't happen, it's not sustainable. Something's going to give. We're going to see cutbacks in the democracy assistance and the development assistance. And those are the ways that we actually get at this, making those kinds of investments. Right now, we're chasing this, and it's unsatisfactory to anyone. I guess the last point I'll make, remember, these people who are fleeing north are not doing it because they're looking to go for a walk, right? They're going because they're driven by some of the worst conditions that we can imagine. What they really want is not humanitarian assistance. They want not to flee. They want to see stronger, safer communities. They want to see attacking some of the vulnerabilities. So for their sake, as well as for our sake, we need to make sure that we're making the right kinds of investments. But right now, with these numbers that we're seeing on the humanitarian front, it's not sustainable. And inevitably, the fallout is going to be cut back on some of these development investments that we know we need to make.
Hey, John, if I could add something to that. One of the things that we recommend in the op-ed is for USAID to put into Panama and Costa Rica senior advisors that can help on the collaboration amongst the U.S. government agencies and amongst the UN organizations. The reason for that is because there's a USAID mission in Colombia, and there's USAID missions in what's called the Northern Triangle, which encompasses Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. In between those, there is not a USAID mission in Panama and Costa Rica. So one of the things that we recommend is to provide senior advisors in those countries to help the interagency in their collaboration efforts. The other thing that we point to is the importance of doubling down on security cooperation. Why? Because one of the things that we learned in Costa Rica, for example, is that Costa Rica in the last about year and a half to 2 years have caught over a dozen terrorists in their territory and have had to deport them. It's better for U.S. security interests to be able to have that security collaboration further down south geographically so that we can catch these bad guys before they head more north.
I want to encourage our viewers and listeners, this article that we've referenced, the op-ed in the Miami Herald, to give it a read. We'll have a link to it along with this podcast. And it includes the kind of recommendations Eddie was just describing, and something, Eddie, you had said earlier that is eloquently summed up in the article you co-wrote. We need to stop acting as though the security threats presented by uncontrolled migration only exist at the U.S.-Mexico border. And I think that sums up a lot of what we've been talking about today. Gentlemen, with about 30 seconds each remaining, any final thoughts, something we didn't get to that you think it's really important for our primary audience on the Hill to understand about this topic?
One thing I'll say is one of the challenges, I think, for the U.S. government is from state to USAID, most of our agencies are organized to work in bilateral terms. They work country by country, but we're talking about historic levels of human flows, of people who are displaced on the move, not where they are or were, not where they're going to be. And so we really need the kinds of cross-cutting, interagency, international approach that Eddie just outlined is crucial. As long as we keep treating this with old approaches and old mechanisms, we're going to keep getting the same result. It really is working closely with our partners. They're great partners. They're doing everything they can to be helpful. Work with them. We have to take this on a regional basis.
Thanks. Eddie, final thought?
Yeah, as a former Hill staffer, one of the things I'll say is I think it's important for Congress in a bipartisan manner to reinvigorate the discussion about the importance of Latin America to U.S. interests. In this scenario, we have Panama and Costa Rica, two very important key allies. Panama, who enjoys a free trade agreement with the U.S., Costa Rica, who is in CAFTA. Trade is an important component to our relationship, but these are two countries who agree with us in terms of democracy, human rights, and I think a lot of times we make the mistake of focusing on the countries who may not agree with us as much in Latin America, and I think we should be supporting the countries who do want to be friends with the U.S., who are extending an olive branch to the U.S. and giving them some attention. I think will go a long way in the region.
Gentlemen, thank you for helping us better understand this most important topic. And for those of you interested in learning more, you can visit wilsoncenter.org. If you use the programs tab at the top of the homepage, you'll find relevant information at the Latin America program, at the Refugees and Forced Displacement Initiative, and elsewhere on the site. We'll be back with another episode of Need to Know soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Milewski. Thanks for your time and interest.